On January 1 of the 59 BC year, Gaius Julius Caesar, who had sacrificed his triumph in order to stand for election, began his consular term alongside co-consul and political enemy, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. Because Caesar had come in first in the voting returns, he was the senior consul, and held the fasces, or symbols of authority, for the first month of the new administration. This forced Bibulus into the background until February, when he would hold the fasces. The first thing Caesar did was to order the scribes to record all Senate business, and to post it outside in the Forum Romanum, for the public to read. Caesar was a populist, and knew he had the people on his side. But, in this, Caesar meant to use public disclosure of senatorial debates to put pressure on his conservative opponents. Bibulus and Cato, both of whom would fight Caesar on any legislative agenda, would now have to convince the public that their opposition to his legislation was motivated by concern for the people, and not simply their dislike of Caesar. Once the scribes and clerks were prepared, Caesar put forward an ambitious, and always controversial bill. Land redistribution had been a goal of reformers and populists since the tribunates of the brothers Gracchi, 70 years earlier. Over the previous century, Italy's agricultural sector had been completely destroyed by the mass influx of slaves from Rome's continuous conquest of the Mediterranean basin. Small landowners and local farms had been bought out by huge megaplantations known as latifundia, which used free slave labor to do the work. Entire generations of poor farmers were suddenly pushed into the cities in search of employment, and subsequently became dependent on state-subsidized bread from Gaius Gracchus's grain dole. But, over recent decades, with Rome's many wars, the latifundia had neglected much of this land, leaving it uncultivated. Domestic grain production dropped drastically, while the demand for state-subsidized grain continued to rise. So much uncultivated land, combined with Rome's ever-growing dependence on foreign grain shipments, was a recipe for economic disaster. On his first day, Caesar proposed legislation that would grant the Senate the authority to set up a land commission, much like the agrarian law proposed by the tribune, Marcus Livius Drusus, in 91 BC, and the legislation defeated by Cicero only 4 years earlier. To prevent the exploitation of Roman fears over the 10 kings, as Cicero had done in 63 BC, Caesar's legislation called for a commission of 20 prominent Romans, instead of 10. This commission would be responsible for buying up land from willing latifundia with unused and uncultivated land to spare. This extra land would then be redistributed to the urban poor via a lottery system. Caesar's legislation would allow thousands to leave the city, and set up small and profitable farms on previously unproductive land. Caesar's legislation also maximized the amount of people who would benefit from this land reform by requiring applicants to be married men with no less than 3 children. Additionally, as part of Caesar's promise to Pompeius Magnus, non-married men could qualify only if they were veterans of the legions. And, to prevent the latifundia from turning around and buying up the land again, applicants could legally not sell the legislated land until 20 years had passed. Many within the Senate were concerned about the cost of Caesar's plan, and the state's loss of income. So, to make his legislation more palatable to them, Caesar exempted the region of Campania, where much of the land was owned by the state, and provided a steady source of income to the treasury. After lengthy debate, some questioned the motives, and raised objections to Caesar's direct involvement in the land distribution process. This forced Caesar to add a line to the bill, barring himself from serving as one of the 20 commissioners. According to the constitutional reforms of the dictator, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, any legislation presented for voting in the plebeian assembly had to be publicly posted in the Forum Romanum for 24 days, so that the people had time to read, and understand, exactly what they were voting on. But, because Caesar's co-consul was among the primary opponents of any legislation he meant to pass, Caesar needed his new law to go into effect before the end of January, while he still held the fasces. Caesar needed the 20 commissioners to be answerable to him, and not to Bibulus. If the 24-day waiting period forced the vote into February, when Bibulus held the fasces, he would simply stack the commission with men of his choosing, whose purpose would be to reject every land sale. This gave Caesar only a few days to get his bill through the Senate if he wanted it to pass the voting assembly before the end of January. After he finished reciting the bill to the Senate, stopping to discuss the points of concern, and rewriting lines according to the outcome, the floor was open for debate. As co-consul, Bibulus spoke first and, to no one's surprise, opposed the legislation on pure principle. However, when it was the turn of the ex-consuls to speak, to the Senate's utter surprise, both Pompeius Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus championed Caesar's agrarian legislation. What the Senate did not know, going into Caesar's 59 BC consulship, was that he had entered into a three-way partnership with both Pompeius and Crassus. Pompeius had conquered the east. He had brought 4 new provinces into Rome, and created new protectorates and alliances. And while the Senate had awarded Pompeius a triumph when he returned to Rome, that was all. Pompeius had tens of thousands of veterans to settle, and plenty of new territory in which to settle them, but had met nothing but resistance from Senate conservatives. Cato, Bibulus, and the others blocked every attempt to ratify Pompeius's eastern settlements, and carve out land for his veterans. Marcus Licinius Crassus, who, because of his dislike for Pompeius, had led some of that opposition, had problems of his own. Rome did not administer her own taxes, but awarded contracts to private companies who bid on how much tax they anticipated collecting in each province. Unfortunately, years of Mithridatic wars had destroyed commerce in the east. This, along with the fact that the publicani had overbid on the contracts, now made it impossible for them to meet their own projections. The publicani had turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, whose business contacts were a considerable source of revenue, and asked him for help. As consul, Crassus had tried to legislate a bailout for the publicani, who were already suffering from Mithridates' war dating back to 70 BC. But Pompeius, his co-consul at the time, had used his allies and power within the Senate to oppose him. Promising to help get land on which Pompeius's veterans might settle, and some bailout concessions for the publicani, Caesar convinced Pompeius and Crassus to support his aggressive land reform bill. This deal was sealed with a marriage contract between Caesar's 17-year-old daughter, Julia, and Pompeius Magnus, the wedding to be held in April of the 59 BC year. This arrangement between Caesar, Pompeius, and Crassus, which history would call the First Triumvirate, was kept secret in the months leading up to Caesar's term as consul. But, on January 1 of the 59 BC year, when Pompeius Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus, Rome's 2 most powerful ex-consuls, with the largest constituencies, spoke in support of Caesar's agrarian bill, the Senate, and specifically the arch-conservatives, sensed something was going on behind the scenes. So, when the speaking opportunity in the debate reached Cato, he stood to speak. Cato complimented the bill's writing, and Caesar's thorough attention to detail, and its careful consideration of senatorial interests, but Cato argued that it was just not a good year to do any type of land reform. Cato talked about the expense of the land reform, other projects more urgently needing the Senate's attention, and possibly even the price of fish and current fashion trends. Anything Cato could find to talk about, he talked about. And he talked. And he talked. And, just as he had done to stop the Senate's coming to a decision regarding Caesar's triumph, Cato filibustered the bill for so long that it became staggeringly obvious he had no intention of giving up the floor until the Senate's meeting was adjourned. This infuriated Caesar, who had gone through the entire process, making compromises and concessions at every turn in order to make the Senate amenable to the legislation. And here was Cato, killing the bill for no better reason than his intense dislike of Caesar's personality. Despite the fact that thousands of Roman citizens stood to gain meaningful employment, and at a cost of nothing more than unused and uncultivated land, Cato had placed his personal hatred of Caesar above his self-proclaimed love of Rome and her people. Snapping, Caesar ordered his lictors to arrest Cato on the spot. Unfortunately for Caesar, this rash decision backfired. The Senate, who had come slowly around to Caesar's legislation, erupted over Caesar's authoritative action. The same Senate that was just about to put its signature to Caesar's bill, suddenly stormed out of the Senate House, claiming they would rather go to prison with Cato, than to remain in the Senate with Caesar. By trampling on its prerogatives, Caesar not only alienated the majority of the Senate, but gave renewed ammunition to his enemies. It was on Caesar's very first day in office that senators began whispering the word, tyrant. Caesar relented, and released Cato, but, since it was obvious the arch-conservatives would not compromise, Caesar got creative. He took his bill and, without the Senate's signature, posted it in the Forum Romanum, along with a proclamation that the plebeian assembly would vote in 24 days. Next, Caesar took to the rostra, where he launched into a series of speeches promoting the bill to the public, drawing larger and larger crowds each day. When Pompeius and Crassus delivered their own speeches in support of Caesar's land reform legislation, increasing its legitimacy with the people, the already suspicious Senate knew for certain that the 3 of them had formed an alliance. Because the co-consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, who was the son-in-law of Cato, opposed the bill, Caesar invited him to come and debate the merits of the legislation before the people. Bibulus came, but the crowd turned on him for standing in opposition to a bill which benefited so many. They hissed and booed him from the stage, and would not allow Bibulus to speak. At the end of the required 24 days, it was time for the plebeian assembly to vote on the bill. Bibulus and Cato, leading a delegation of conservative tribunes of the plebs, arrived early on the day of the vote. That they had packed their delegation with tribunes meant they intended to use the tribunes' veto against the proceedings. But, upon their arrival, the people flew into a rage. As Bibulus tried to make his way towards the speaking platform, he was surrounded and restrained by the mob. Bibulus's lictors were quickly overpowered, and then Bibulus was pulled to the ground, and the people began dumping buckets of feces on his head. The other conservatives, thinking Bibulus was being murdered, fled for their lives. Once they were gone, Caesar called for the vote on his land reform bill, which passed with an overwhelming majority. The next day, in the Senate, a battered and bruised Bibulus claimed Caesar's law was null and void because, while he was being assaulted by the crowd, Bibulus had shouted veto the entire time. Caesar, however, made a counter-claim that the roar of the crowd meant that no veto was heard. Finally, after 7 decades of land reform attempts, many of which resulted in the deaths of the politicians, Caesar's legislation passed. He could now appoint his commissioners. Topping the list were his allies, Pompeius Magnus and Marcus Licinius Crassus. On the 1st of February, Bibulus, as co-consul, took control of the fasces. He immediately called a meeting of the Senate where he officially condemned the actions of Caesar, for his use of mob violence. Bibulus demanded the Senate overturn Caesar's law, and called for a vote. The speaking order, determined by rank, or dignitas, began with the senior consul, Caesar, who obviously spoke in his own defense. Then came the consuls of previous years. The two most important just so happened to be Pompeius and Crassus. When they spoke against overturning Caesar's law, the rest of the Senate got the message. Not only did Caesar have some sort of influence over the mob, he also seemed in control of Rome's two most powerful senators. After Pompeius and Crassus voted, no other senator wanted to be on the record as criticizing Caesar. The Senate was now slightly afraid of Caesar, and Bibulus's proposal did not pass. As a result, Bibulus retreated to his home, vowing not to appear publicly again for the remainder of his term. Given the self-imposed absence of his co-consul, Caesar now held the fasces for every month of his consular term. After securing his signature piece of legislation, Caesar began the work of paying back his allies. His next order of business was to ratify Pompeius's eastern conquests. When, in April of that same year, Pompeius married Caesar's daughter, Julia, the Senate knew any efforts at resisting would fail. Caesar also forced the Senate into approving the necessary funds to settle Pompeius's many legions in the newly conquered eastern territories. During the debates, the ex-consul, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, from whom Pompeius had stripped command of the eastern campaign, tried to oppose Caesar's legislation. Caesar, however, stated that perhaps it was time the Senate investigate old charges of corruption, possibly dating as far back as the reign of the dictator Sulla, under whose rule Lucullus had mysteriously thrived. Lucullus cleverly reacted to Caesar's threat by throwing himself on the floor at Caesar's feet, where he groveled and begged Caesar's forgiveness. This embarrassed Caesar mightily, as it painted him as a tyrant before the entire Senate, which was what Lucullus anticipated. Finally, after settling Pompeius's legislation, Caesar turned to Crassus. He lowered the amount the publicani were taxed by 33.3%, allowing them to recover from their losses from the Mithridatic Wars. During Caesar's flurry of legislative activity, Bibulus, who remained housebound, continued to oppose his laws. Because he was consul, he had the authority to designate holy days when state business could not take place. Every date Caesar scheduled a vote, Bibulus stamped as holy, thereby voiding any laws Caesar passed. But Caesar, who was Pontifex Maximus, and therefore the highest religious authority in the land, outranked Bibulus's divination of holy days, and the laws were not nullified. And, since Bibulus was quickly becoming the laughingstock of Rome, the people, entertained at the co-consul's expense, were content to go along with Caesar's political theater. Besides attending to all his legislation, Caesar also married his next wife. Her name was Calpurnia, and she was the 17-year-old daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso Caesoninus, a prominent senator. To address the conservatives' hijacking of the provincial placement of consuls, who had charged Caesar with the clean-up of Italy's degrading forestland and country lanes, Caesar used a tribune of the plebs to overturn that legislation, as well as granting Caesar, instead, the governorships of both Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum. Besides granting 2 provinces instead of 1, his bill also legislated a 5-year term for Caesar, instead of the normal 2-year terms. Though it was the Senate's prerogative to choose each governor's legates, Caesar was also granted the right to choose his own legates. As the bill regarding Caesar's governorship was being debated, the Senate was notified that the governor of Transalpine Gaul had died. Transalpine Gaul was then added to Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, so that with the passing of the legislation, Caesar was awarded 3 provinces, and a total of 4 legions, for a period of 5 years. The consular elections for the 58 BC year, which were pushed back until October due to Bibulus's constant attempt to hinder assemblies through the naming of holy days, were finally held. When the votes were counted, the winners were Caesar's father-in-law, Piso Caesoninus, and the man who had written the bill that made Pompeius Magnus the single most powerful man in the Roman Empire, Aulus Gabinius.